Did you? Oh, perfect. Hey, Sean, how are you today?
Good. How are you, Tiff?
I'm good. I know we were just speaking about the morning going by so quickly, but I feel like the whole week's been going by so quickly.
It has. What is it? Wednesday? It's Wednesday. We're
It's,
halfway done.
I know. Oh, I can hear my voice. One second. Oh, there we go. Sorry about that, Sean. I had
Oh,
the YouTube video that's playing our live stream on. I had the YouTube tab open as well. Technical.
oh yes. I've done this before. Yes. Very distracting.
Where is this sound coming from? But anyways, I'm really excited to connect with you today. I know we've had a few conversations more high level thus far about using Notion as a content source for teams' websites. And this is a topic that you've really explored further. So I'm looking forward to connecting on it today.
Yes. Yes. Thank you. I've done a lot of thinking and tinkering. This one particular proof of concept that I'll dig into a little bit. I spent a good like 2, 3 months just kind of exploring, and I think there's some real power behind it, but it's open to interpretation. And so, yeah, I'll let you guide it, but excited to dive in.
I am too. And before we dive into it, I'm curious to know what was the incentive or what inspired you to start looking into to using Notion as a content source when you started down this path?
Yes. Okay. Love that question because in particular because I hated Notion when I first started using it. Hated it
Hey.
so much. Yes, I probably this is probably 3 years ago or so. I don't know, 2019, 20, yeah, somewhere in there, 2019 or so, because it was at 2 previous jobs ago. Looking at bringing it in to a team setting, using it for sharing notes, meeting agendas, that sort of thing. And it just felt really, it felt slow, it felt clunky. I mean, it was you needed an internet connection to be able to use it. And to me at that time, it felt like they were trying to do everything all these other tools were doing, and they weren't doing anything as well as any of those tools were doing it. And then about a year and a half ago, maybe, I don't totally remember the timing, but at some point, well, actually, first of all, when I started at Stackbit, we were really, really, really heavy Notion users. In fact, we were planning all of our engineering tasks in Notion, which kind of blew my mind. I was like, okay, well, if this company has gone all in on Notion to the point that they're running their engineering team out of Notion, maybe I'm missing something. I don't know. And so I was kind of forced to use it again, and embraced it and realized, like, okay, well, there's some value in the flexibility of it. Our engineering team, our whole company is getting a lot of use out of it. Still, I don't I was trying to start to use it for myself personally, and it just didn't feel right. I still kept all my content in fragmented spots based on like what is each tool doing best. And then a few months after starting at Stackbit, so yeah, probably about year and a half ago, the Notion released their developer API. And so all of a sudden, you could access all of the content in Notion through their API. And we immediately saw this explosion of all these different developers using Notion for really creative ways because they could get that content. And I've always also been, I'm a big CMS nerd, and love thinking about the best way that we can design our schemas and make it convenient for engineers to work with code and content structures, and also be able to make really efficient, effective experiences for content editors as well. And so what I realized in tinkering with the API is that Notion has a really fantastic structure that is underneath everything. So every time you hit enter on your keyboard, it looks like you're just adding another paragraph, but behind the scenes, it's a whole other object. And so every page in Notion, they technically call a block. It's just a special kind of block. And then that page is just made up of blocks. Blocks are basically components, and that's essentially how we build the web today. And so there's, while Notion is fairly opinionated about the blocks or the components that they allow you to work with, the foundation is ultimately really flexible. And I think that's why we started to see this explosion of all these different use cases with Notion. And so more recently, while I've dug into some of these other different approaches to it, um, I've thought, if a team is already using Notion, then why not take advantage of that flexibility and create some opinions and maybe some other internal tooling around it so that you can continue to work with the tools that you're already using.
I love that. And where you kind of started your journey with Notion is very familiar to me, in the sense of I was extraordinarily wrong about my assumptions around it, but I thought, oh, it's a place to keep your notes or your to-do lists or your tasks. And that's what I thought initially. Obviously, that's completely incorrect, but that was my hesitation around it too. And then, similar to your journey, I was more so forced to use it when starting here at Stackbit. It's like, all right, let's get into it. And even for a while, I would use other tools, and I still catch myself doing this, although Notion is way easier to do it, but just old habits, using other tools for different tasks when it could all be done directly within Notion. And it's really great for sharing and collaboration and all of that. So it's very interesting how we have similar beginnings to falling in love with Notion in the end.
For sure. The other thing I didn't add here is that I think they also took a lot of care and intention in designing their the actual editor experience itself, so that if you think about something like Google Docs, Google Docs is really great if you're just writing this long form content. It's the classic Microsoft Word equivalent. Like I'm making some sort of Word document. That's something that I would traditionally use a word processor for. And because I think one of the things that Notion does really well is they've got that structured content base, but they also paired it with a really thoughtful editor experience. And what I mean by that is loads and loads of keyboard shortcuts. So you can write in Markdown, which most word processors aren't really supporting. And there's lots of shortcuts for, hey, I wrote this thing that looks like a paragraph, but it's actually a block, and I can just move it and indent it. And so I think it also works well because non-technical people get it because it's close enough to the traditional word processing system. But developers also don't hate writing in it because there are little conveniences that you can use with your keyboard to move really, really fast.
Yeah. I love that. And yeah, recently when we were talking about another way that you use Notion for around publishing, which might be a different conversation, but I learned recently that you can export these. I don't know what they would technically be called, but pages or documents as HTML or Markdown or however you would like, which is really interesting too.
For sure, for sure. And as we get into this, I have a short little demo I can show that kind of touches on that topic.
Perfect. Well, Sean, you know what? Maybe let's dive into the demo, and then throughout that, I'll continue to pick your brain. But maybe the demo is a good place to move to next.
Great, great, great. Let's do it. All right.
Actually, as you pull up the demo here, you mentioned at the end, you summed it up by essentially saying it's a tool that your content editors or non-technical folks can easily use, make changes to, and then also to developers enjoy it as well. And I just got to do a little plug because that sounds a lot like Stackbit in that summary.
Yes, definitely. And that's what I feel like. I I did this proof of concept, kept iterating on it, and I got to this point and I was thinking, okay, this is really powerful, but there's some really brittle pieces in it and some really challenge like technically challenging pieces that I think if we paired Stackbit with it, it could get really, really powerful
Yeah.
for developers and content editors. So I'll talk a little bit about, maybe we can dig into that a little bit after we go through this. Okay, so the concept is, if I go back to what we were talking about previously, which was everything in, so if you take a Notion database, for example, they call these pages. Every record in the database is a page, and a page is a specific type of block. And a block or a page has then a number of blocks within it. And then blocks can have children as well. So this is just a bunch of placeholder copy. But if I were to create a new paragraph block here and I indent it, now this is a child of the parent, or of this block. So if we select this, for example, it selects the whole thing. And I have one kind of parent paragraph block and one child paragraph block. And so I was, as right after that API got released, and I mentioned a bunch of developers flocked to all these different things you could do with the API. I felt like the thing I was seeing the most is using Notion as a CMS. And I was like, wow, that's really interesting. I'm super skeptical, but it's really interesting. And so I started thinking about that and tinkering with the concept, and realized that it's definitely possible and really powerful for very simple sites. Because you think about, what types of blocks does Notion offer? Well, we have paragraphs, and we can do things like, if we play around with the keyboard shortcuts here, you've got a little toggle list or a block quote or a code block, or numbered lists. And these are all, for the most part, components, or block types that have a one-to-one mapping with a primitive HTML element. So there are paragraphs in Notion, and there are paragraphs that are available as HTML tags, and ordered lists and unordered lists and code blocks and block quotes. The majority of those things have a one-to-one mapping to primitive HTML elements. And so if that's what you're using, this is super powerful. Think about blog site. Okay, I'm gonna spin up a blog site. Amazing. I could write all of my blog posts in Notion. I can just have a one-to-one mapping, essentially, of a Notion block to a component on the front end, and it works, pretty seamlessly, and honestly, without too much effort. The problem is, almost every site has some component, really not even necessarily, not necessarily super complex components, but a component that might have a little bit of interactivity, or something that needs maybe an extra attribute that Notion doesn't have. And so the two examples I'm playing with that I feel like are pretty common, one is a tab component.
Mhm.
So Notion doesn't have a tab component. Another one is a code block. This is probably an even simpler example. So Notion has a code block,
Yeah.
and I can select the language, I can write the code, and that has a great, could map to something in my blog. Well, now what do I do if I want to add, say, a little file name label above my code block to add some context to it?
Oh.
Not really an easy way to do that. I mean, you could say, oh, well, maybe you could add another paragraph. Okay, but that's really, it's really specific. And how do I know that the paragraph I'm adding is related to the code block label? It gets really complicated really quickly. And so I thought, okay, well, then Notion as a CMS, the idea kind of does it just fall apart immediately if I get remotely complicated, or not even remotely complicated, but if I just start to add some really simple components to my site? And after I was kind of iterating on that idea for a while, I realized, well, what Notion has this one component that I love and overuse, and it's one that is one, it's not a native HTML component, and two, it has some extra attributes to it. And that thing is the callout component. So if
Oh,
you add a callout component in Notion, callout component comes with, first of all, a callout component is not an HTML element as far as I know. And it comes with this ability to add icons to it.
wow.
And other blocks in Notion, you can also you can customize the styling. Like you could say let's come up here. Maybe the whole background up here is blue, and you can do that sort of thing. And then you can do the same thing with the call out as well. Make it blue. And so what I thought was, all right, what if we took what if we built this opinionated sort of system where we took a comment. You could use styles. In my example, I'm just using icons. So what if we created this library, this mapping opinion, where if you select a certain type of icon and provide a specific structure within your callout, that you're basically creating the structure of content that you can then map to components on your front end.
Wow.
Okay, so for example, here's my page with components over here. Great. Okay, so what if, here's a simple paragraph block. What if this is how you could specify, hey, I want a tab component. This might be a little hard to see because I'm in dark mode here, but I have this one big call out that is just a call out block. And then this icon is using one of Notion's provided custom icons. And I think it's actually called, what is it called? I don't remember. Doesn't matter. And then this component has children components, each of which are also call out blocks. And then they have a specific icon, which may or may not matter. They have one line of text, and then they have children paragraph blocks in there. Okay, so I'm going to come back to that in a minute. And then here's an example of what the code block with the file name might look like. Here's my code icon, which tells me, okay, this is a code block component, and the first line is meant to be the file name, and then you are expected to have a code block inside of it. So you can see that, and there's a number of different ways that you could approach this, just like there are a number of different ways that if you had to model this content within a content management system, you would still have to come up with the opinion of what are the attributes you're going to use, how is that going to map to items on your front end. So this is a similar sort of scenario. The hard part that we can come back to at the end is that it's also super brittle because you are relying on someone who's creating the content to really understand this syntactical structure and to have to follow it if they want that component. And that's hard to do. So on one hand, the power is, it's extremely powerful. And on the other hand, it's really brittle. And I'll just take you through a really, really quick example. So in Notion, you have to basically I have this series of 4 different projects, and I'm going to just show you 3 of them to go, or really just 2 to go quickly. The first one is it actually retrieves the ID of the database from Notion, which oddly enough it's not surfaced in the URL on the web app. So you have to go through the API, search for the database, find the database, get the ID, and then you can start to work with the ID or with the database. It's confusing. Okay, so I have this second example here, which is called export page data. And so this, I think, is what you were referring to originally. And basically what this is doing, I won't spend too much time on this, but it's just this one script. And it's basically going into the Notion database, getting all of the pages. So we're importing the pages. So it's talking, or it's specifying the ID, getting all of the pages. And then this is wild, but it actually has to hit the API again to get all of the blocks for each page. And then if a block has children, it has to hit the API again for all of the children of all of those blocks.
Right.
And yeah. Okay. I haven't found a way to do this more efficiently yet. It might exist. They might have made some updates. I'm not sure, but you essentially have this n+1 problem. Basically, for every block, you have to hit the API to get the content for it.
Even when it's child components or child.
Yes. Yeah. So right. So the blocks children don't come with that block from the API automatically. You know, I was comparing this to working with, say, Contentful's API, where what you can do with Contentful is everything's a reference. So if you have children, it's a reference to another record, or they call them entries.
Mhm.
And you know, you can go all the way down the rabbit hole with having a really complex model. Well, when you hit the API for a particular record in Contentful, you can say, hey, I only want you to go 5 levels deep, but then pull all of that information and give it back to me in the response. So what I've found so far is we can't really do that with Notion.
Interesting.
Okay, so if I run this, it'll take a minute because it's going to hit the API so many times, but it is going to, it's targeting this particular database. It's going to get both of those pages, and then it's going to pull all of the block information from those pages. And then it wrote it to this file called Notion export.json, and we've got a lot of information, almost 1,100 lines. And it's you see, it's super structured. So every component is an object. It's specifying when you have text in there, it breaks those up as individual objects so that if you bold text, then it becomes its own little entry. If you have a link, there's attributes for href and other items in there. So really super powerful. Also, no one wants to work with this information if you're going to try to transform this into something that you can use for a database. Like, okay, I'm a front-end developer. I don't want 1,100 lines of data to have to create 2 pages.
Exactly.
So that's what our second script does, is it then has this opinion. This is where the opinion comes in, and it says, and then this script this is where we can talk about the practicality of this and how you might apply it. You know, even we've got 100 lines of code here for really just supporting paragraphs, tabs, and code blocks. But it's doing some powerful things here as well. So for example, if it finds that code block callout and you match the structure right, it's going to grab the code from within that code block, and it's also going to run it through highlight.js. So it'll provide syntax highlighting information. And then that means the code on your front end, you have to do very little. You only have to bring the CSS from the highlight.js library because it's already all been processed. So the idea here is that once you export all the content, you can then have this opinionated transformer script that takes that content, structures it very specifically, and then is basically ready to use within your website. Show you what I mean.
Interesting. So it'd be less of the front end, in this case, less of the front end developer writing for example, HTML or whatever the case is that's written in Notion. And then they would be adding more. So taking that, which is already created, as you mentioned, opinionated, and adding, say, some styling to it, or I guess it would just be styling really that they would or could add. Is that correct?
Pretty much, yes. I think you would do as much work as you could during that transformation step so that your front end code, I think, there's 2 benefits to this. One, it simplifies your front end code because you have to do less processing and have fewer opinions in it. And 2, it also helps protect you from vendor lock-in. So obviously you're fairly locked into Notion if you take this approach, but you're not locked in to your front end code, or at least minimally locked into that front end code, because all of the work from the content side of things has already been figured out. So at that point, it's really just making components work with content that's getting fed into them. So after I ran this script, it gave me this content.json file. And then this is much simpler. So we've got less than 100 lines of code, and you can see, okay, here's my page object. I
Mhm.
have an ID, title. I've calculated the URL path, and then these blocks have been stripped down to exactly what a component might expect. It
Yeah.
specifies it as a paragraph and gives you the text. Or down here, specifies it as a code block, gives you the file name, gives you the code that you would, the HTML code that you would just plop in, and then you'd add the highlight.js CSS file, and you're good to go. Specify the language, all of those sorts of things, and then tabs, really simple, structured. And so I won't show you the end of this, but basically you could imagine, like, very, very simple to take this sort of information, create some composable page where you basically have you're looking for each block's component property and mapping that to some specific component in your code, and then it appears. Okay, that's the demo. I'm going to stop there because I feel like I've been talking for a while. I'm sure you have a lot of questions.
I have so many questions. I'm trying to be mindful of time, but I feel like I could talk to you. I think we need a part two to this as well, because this was so fascinating to me. I think, let me think here, because I want to ensure that the questions I asked are not taking us all over the place, because there's a few different ways we could go with this. One way, one question, or one theme of questions, as we are talking more about how teams can use Notion in their websites, and this is a huge question, but based on what you just shown and what we just spoke about, do you think, I mean, I understand from a technical standpoint, the possibility is there to be scalable. Do you think this is something that teams could or should scale with? Like, what are some of the pros and cons with starting out this way? Because from my understanding, it would be pretty affordable to go this route to start with, at least. And then what you just shown, you're definitely able to take those JSON files and maybe transfer it to a different format of a database, potentially, depending on how that database works. I guess my question is, yeah, how is this something that a team could start with as they are smaller and scale with?
I think so, yes, especially because websites generally start simpler and then grow in complexity over time. I think that uh, okay, so to address the benefits, one
Mhm.
benefit, as we talked about early on, is that you can work with content or work with tools that you're already working with. So if your team is already using Notion in some way, or if you think there's some benefit to doing that, kind of wild that your task management system could also be your content management system. I mean, there's
Yeah.
some real power in that. Like you mentioned, cost. Yes, definitely. If you're paying for Notion, you don't have to also pay for a content management system. You have to pay for the time to develop the strategy and your approach using it as a content management system. But the tooling itself is already paid for. So I think there's some real benefit to that. In terms of where you would store it, I mean, the core of the content is already stored in Notion.
Yeah.
Yes, maybe you want to cache it in some way. Um, I think you bring up a good point in where does it actually live? So yeah, it lives in Notion, but and I mentioned you're potentially locked into Notion, which is, maybe a red flag, but to some extent you're locked into whatever CMS you can have
Yeah.
because all that content is retrievable from the CMS. And because you built this opinionated mapping and transforming system, you're basically left with this structure that you could probably transform again fairly easily and then just import into some other content source if you needed to move away, grow, scale, etc. In terms of what is most challenging,
Mhm.
I haven't I haven't tried to do this at scale. And what I've seen with the way that I've interacted with the API so far, I could see it really slowing down as a site grows. Now there's and I think this kind of goes back to the traditional static site generator or Jamstack approach, where if you're just running this one build
Mhm.
every time you need new content, it's it it's like it gets slower in a linear kind of way usually. And so the bigger a site gets, the slower the build becomes, and eventually it becomes unmanageable. So I think you'd have to take some approaches there to see how can you scale, cache, et cetera. And certainly there are ways to do that. You could look at, for example, you could look at you could cache all of the exported content and at one time, and then when you run it again, you could say, okay, I've got this high watermark. What pages have been updated since that high watermark? And then replace that content. So you can be smart about that from a scale perspective. The other challenge, of course, is the brittleness of the approach and the amount of opinion that you need to add into this. And of course, you need to do that if you're going to work with essentially any headless CMS. But when you do that with a traditional headless CMS, you are creating that opinion and that schema, but then the CMS manifests it as structured fields. And doesn't mean your editors can't break the site, but it does mean that they don't necessarily need to know the name of a field. You don't have to remember what icon you need to use to make a tab component. And so that's where I think something like Stackbit wrapped around this could have a real benefit. And so we can dive into that or not. I don't know what you want to do in terms of time, or if you had other places you wanted to go here.
No, that was definitely where my mind was just naturally going. Was one of the next questions I had for you is, and obviously this is dependent on teams and how they function. But one of the questions I had is, well, who should, because of what you just mentioned about the brittleness factor, who should be in Notion? Who should be the ones in Notion? Should it just be developers? Should it be content editors? But I think that it naturally kind of answered itself with, if you're going to go this route and then you can use a tool like Stackbit, then it sounds like just developers should be in Notion for the most part in this case. And then content editors could be making changes in Stackbit.
Yeah, I think you could adjust it based on where you land. Notion does have a component called a button, and a button can programmatically do some limited things. And one of those things is that you can use a button to basically to add essentially, I don't remember their terminology for it, but at Stackbit we call them basically a preset or a template of blocks. So you could say, I've got these buttons on my page, and if I click a button that says add tabs, that it then it adds that structure for you automatically, and then you could fill it in. So if you took an approach like that, then you might say, okay, man, maybe this is reasonable to keep my content editors in here. There's still risk of moving things around accidentally, for sure. You could also put some checks in your scripts to, be smart and informative about what might have changed or gone wrong, or et cetera, be a little bit more fluid. So I think there are paths to having content editors or even just non-technical folks be in this space and actually editing the content, but it is still brittle. Now at Stackbit, with the Stackbit editor. So, not to go into like a whole introduction on exactly what Stackbit is, but it is a visual editing application where content can come from any one or more sources. We can pull it in, edit it in Stackbit, and then store that back in the content source. And so what we could do, and one other thing there is that the main mechanism that makes this work is called content source interface. And we have various plugins that we call modules for CSI that point to a particular and work with a particular content source. So Contentful is one. So you can it's a turnkey solution right now. You specify Contentful, add your credentials, and boom, you're ready to go. Your content is already synced with Contentful. It's amazing. Now, we could build something like this for Notion. And we could theoretically use this approach of some call out system
Mhm.
and um, and and map or like use that to we could define a structure
Yeah.
in Stackbit, and then that module in Stackbit could take that structure and look for some specific type of call out structure in Notion, and then write and also read from it. So it's like it's a very structured CMS, even though it looks like a really fluid editing experience. So what that means is that in Stackbit, you could pull up your site within a tab, change something, or even say new component tab, and it looks like it's going to look on the front end,
Yeah.
but it saves it back in Notion in that very specific way.
Yes.
And I think the really interesting thing about this is that when we work with a headless CMS, it works the same way, but it stores it back in the source application, which is inherently often difficult to navigate because just it's like all these forms, it gets really complicated,
So quick.
hard to figure out like where how they map exactly.
Yeah.
Whereas with Notion, you have you still have a like semi visual representation of where your content lives. So you could, if you had someone who loved working in Notion and understood, they could stay right there and continue to work there.
Mhm.
While others who want to be more precise, maybe it's, you know, you want more guardrails or whatever it might be, that you could have those folks working in Stackbit,
Mhm.
having real time previews and everything. So I think there's some real potential, real power here.
I think so too. I really, really, I know I'm saying this on a live, so, but I really think it'd be so fun so interesting, like you said, the power of it there to put together a demo with exactly what you just spoke about with Stackbit and Notion and seeing that in real time would be super fascinating because Notion is this tool that, and now I'm saying this maybe because I am a Notion user now, but it feels like everyone is using, or so many people to varying degrees are using or familiar with at the very least. It's very user friendly to get started. So it'd just be very interesting to see that full workflow that you just mentioned as well. And, you know, I know you have a lot of the code down right now for the reading and writing with Notion, and then as well what was the component that is what is it called, the one that you found in Notion, or the block that is best to do this with?
Oh, the
Uh,
call out block.
Call out block. Yes, that sounds like it would be a really good way to go as well. So I think we should. I'm curious to hear what viewers want to see as well around this, but I think it'd be a very interesting project to work on.
Yeah, because I mean, and it's just one approach. I think it's that the if we were to integrate it with Stackbit, we'd have some questions and certainly some challenges along the way. Like, what do you do with images? Because for Notion, they offer images. Their images are stored on AWS S3,
Mhm.
but the links expire, I think, in a day, and so
Oh,
you can't just keep the source link. Otherwise, your links will be broken tomorrow after you build your site. So it's like, okay, well, you got to put them somewhere else in the process. So
yeah.
again, just another problem to solve. But for example, I thought callouts was a really interesting approach
Mhm.
because even though it's opinionated,
Mhm.
someone who isn't super technical can still work with that and create something really powerful on the front end of their site. But of course, another thing that you could do is you could just say every block
Mhm.
is a code block, and it's going to just store JSON code that is the representation of my content. And it's like some kind of a silly thing. And then it becomes way less visual, but it's also storing the content in a place and with a tool that you're already using. So it's basically just a glorified database at that point. But my point there is call out isn't the only approach. It just felt to me like uh, a way to be a little bit visual and use it as a solution that doesn't necessarily need Stackbit, but that you could certainly make much more powerful with Stackbit.
Yeah, definitely. And it sounds like a good happy medium too for people who are going into Notion who might not be as technical as the next person, but they still get this visual aspect to it as well.
Exactly. Exactly.
It sounds like one big takeaway from this is it's extremely flexible and you can kind of customize it to your needs with challenges along the way.
For sure. For sure. Yes. And I think if I mean that's the core of this for sure. Is that you
Mhm.
can build whatever you want, but you have to build it. And that's kind of why I think the Stackbit story is a little bit interesting too, is that we would probably have to come up with some opinion on how that content should be stored in Notion to be able to integrate with Stackbit. But if we did that, then the result is that you have to do way less work to create those structures. You would just say, hey, in code, and two, in a much more declarative,
Mhm.
safe way, this is my schema, this is what I expect. And Stackbit will then add validations to that, which you can't really get unless you write them yourself if you're doing the Notion only solution.
Mhm. That's super interesting, Sean. And I know we try and keep these lives, under 30 minutes, and we're at 41 now. So I'll stop my questions there. But for anyone watching, I know there's so much we can uncover with this. So leave your questions down below in the comments. Sean, I know you've also written some posts around Notion, so I'll link those down in the description too. And I know it's easier said than done. Me being like, this is exciting, let's build something today. But I definitely think it's worth exploring further because it just seems like there's a lot of potential there. It's really interesting.
I think so. I'm really curious to see what folks think, and if we get some interest around that, because it would be really fun to build a demo and to see what's possible here.
I agree. I agree. Give this video a thumbs up or comment if you're interested, because that will support our cause to go forward with building this.
That's right. That's right.
Awesome. Thanks, Sean, for your time and the really awesome demo. It was really great.
Thanks, Tiff. It was fun.
Yeah. Talk soon.
All right.
Bye.
Bye.